Here I have the parts for the dust seal all set out and arranged like they are going to be attached. And so you can see that this front piece extends over here and these side pieces come down and there's no piece at the back. It's not necessary and the hinges are back there anyway. We are going to cut a single dovetail on each of these ends, and that tail will mate into a pin at either end of this front part of the seal. And so the first thing to do is always, when you're going to do a construction, is you're going to want to put a cabinet maker's triangle on the top surface that shows which way is front, and so you can always know which way is left and which way is right, because you don't want to get these guys turned around. And also so that you keep that front part of the dust seal orientated correctly, is I've put a little cabinet maker's triangle there too, and that will guide me through the whole dovetail process. So I'm going to put the lid aside to clear the bench, and now we will get into the dovetailing proper. Like I said before, if this is not your thing, you can very easily glue and screw those the seal on, but as you'll see, this is a lot of fun, and it's one tail. It's kind of hard to mess up. First thing to do is to take your marking gauge and set it to the thickness of your stock. So I'm just going to get my marking gauge in there as tight as I can, and then set it, and it is indeed the exact thickness of the stock. And then I'm going to scribe what we call our baseline on all four surfaces on the end of our tail board and our pin board. So this is my tail board. So I have now put the scribe line or the baseline on that. Do the same thing here. I like to make it nice and deep so that I can see it. Other woodworkers like to use a real light line so they can easily plane it off. And then on our pin board, the front part of the dust seal, we only have to put the baseline on the front surface and the back surface. We don't need to put it on the edges. And if you have never cut dovetails, you will soon learn why that is the case. So, scribe that, and now I can put that aside and put that aside. So I'm going to begin with this end, and I'm going to secure it in my vise for marking. I like to have it as vertical as possible just so that it's consistently easy to saw. And now I'm going to mark the tail. I just mark out the tail in pencil, and a lot of people will just go for it and cut without any guidelines. Since this is such a visible part of the chest, I am instead going to use a ruler to start the tail at 3/16 from the end. So move that line down, join to the baseline, and then do the same thing over here. So I'm going to use the ruler to set my little dovetail marker. And you can make these out of wood. This is a cheap aluminum, inexpensive aluminum one from Veritas. And then I'm just going to draw in my baselines, and I'll show you what that looks like here. So now you can see I have that single tail marked out on the end of this board, and I am going to saw away this area, and that'll create the tail that we will then show to the front part of the seal to make the pin. You don't need to mark it on both faces. You don't have a detachable eye that can see what you're doing there, so don't even bother. That's just a waste of time. And get that square. And then when I saw dovetails, the way that I keep everything, all the cuts right where they need to be, is I begin the cut here at the far corner, just with the tip of the saw, and then I nibble back, as you'll see, all the way along here, along the end grain, to create a little trough for the saw to follow down. As I then, after I create that trough, then I will saw down to the baseline. And that allows me to stay right on 90, because the saw will follow the path of least resistance. So I've created a little 90-degree trough, and then it'll stay 90 as I go down. So have my thumb here. So I just nibble back, blow, nibble and blow, to follow that line back, and then use long strokes to go down to the baseline. Now, if I don't hit that pencil line just right, it doesn't matter because this joint, this side of the joint's a template for the second side. So I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Put my thumb out to support the saw, and then I'm just going to nibble at that far corner. Nibble back, nibble, and blow the dust away so I can see the line. Now I've created that trough, so I can then charge for the baseline with nice long strokes. I try not to force the saw or push the saw down into the cut too much, because that will, if your hand tenses up, you will tend to go off line and it'll get all wobbly. So now I'm just going to cut away those little end bits. As you can see, I've cut this line and I've cut this line. Now I'm going to come in here and create the tail. So come in like that. And I'm going to run a pencil through my baseline so I can see it better. A lot of people will use a crosscut saw for this because it is a crosscut, but usually dovetail saws have such fine teeth that it really doesn't cause much tearing. So I rather than switch saws, I just keep the same saw in hand. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to start at the far corner. I'm going to nibble back so I get a perfectly 90-degree trough, and then I'm going to plunge down, straight down. So nibble and blow, nibble and blow. It's probably going to be on my tombstone, nibble and blow. Nice, long, even strokes. This is a real visible part of the joint. And as you can see, creates a nice little shoulder. So I'm going to do the same thing, and you noticed I flipped the work over so I can always see my line. I can see where I cut. If I can't see my line, I can't cut to my line. So I'm going to put that in there. I'm going to use both fingers to pinch, nibble, and blow. Nice long strokes. You'll get way fast at this after a while, but just take your time, especially on your first dovetail of the day and you're getting warmed up. So now you can see, I didn't hit my pencil line perfectly, but it doesn't matter because this is just going to be a template for the second one. And before I do use this joint to mark out the pin joint, I'm going to just get in there with my chisel and make sure that it is clean enough, that all the corners are clean. And I just get in there and just clean the junk out of the corner. And make sure that that saw cut got to my baseline. Otherwise the joint won't close right. So I'm just going to remove just a little bit of junk there. And I'll do the same on the other side. So these are pretty good. I've done better, but this is my first dovetail of the day. And just like anything else, you get warmed up. Okay, there we go. A little bit of junk in there. All right, that's nice and clean. So now I have this, and I'm going to show this to my pin board. I'm going to bring this pin board over, and I'm going to check my triangle. So I know that this, based on my triangle, that this tail is going to mate here. And so I don't get turned around, and it is real easy to get turned around. I'm going to first, swing everything together so that it's kept in alignment. And then, after I square this up, now I'm going to double check my triangles. I can see my triangle's facing forward here, and it's on this edge. So when I put it here and I look down there, I can also see my triangle facing forward. You might think that this is kind of ridiculous for somebody who's been cutting dovetails for 20-something years, but you still have to go through these same procedures every time so you don't make a mistake. I've seen professionals, woodworkers who do this all the time, make a case that won't go together because they got in a hurry. So the next step we're going to do is we are going to take a knife this time and use a knife to transfer the cut. So I am going to just balance this on the end of the pin board, and I'm going to make sure everything's lined up by taking this chisel and line it up on those two long edges, and then flush it up on the front with my thumb, and that's all good. And then I'm just going to make a mark there, and like I knifed before, you just want to use real light strokes at first before you add any downward pressure. And that will prevent the knife from wandering all over the place. Okay. And now I'm just going to take my pencil and run it in those knife lines so that I can see where I'm cutting, and I'll make an X so that I know that that's my waist. If you are really good at sawing straight 90 without any guidance, then you don't need to do this next step. I will take a square that has a perfectly square side, vertical side, and just take that line down to my baseline. I'll show you what that looks like here in a second. And just get a pencil and join it to your knife line, and mark your baseline and mark your waist. This is another place that people make mistakes, is that here are the 90-degree lines we pulled down from the end, and then down to our baseline, and then I marked an X for the waist. The reason I do that is because if you saw on the wrong side of the line, the joint will be completely loose, just like this, you know, really loose tooth. So it's a real easy mistake to make. So definitely mark your waist. Even people who have been doing it their whole lives, like Frank Klaus, mark the waist. And so that should tell you something. And then I'm just going to remove this, this pin from the pin board. And I'm going to do exactly the same thing I did when I was cutting the tail, which is I'm going to start at this far corner here, and I'm going to nibble back and then go straight down. This time, though, after I nibble this trough all the way from the back part of the edge to the front part of the bench, then I'm going to turn all of my attention to staying right next to that line on the face that's facing me, because these have to be not only the correct angle up here, but the correct perfect 90-degree angle here for the joint to go together. And that's another place people get turned around. So this is the joint that really is this side of the joint is the real critical one. So, and you want to leave the line, especially in poplar. Poplar compresses a little bit. If you take half the line like you would in a really dense hardwood, you know, it'll be a little loose. And if you leave too much, then the joint will split. So I'm going to just get right next to this line. Now I've created that trough. So now I'm going to plunge straight down, and I'm going to follow my pencil line, and I'm just going to take my time. I would go a little faster if I weren't on camera. Want to try to use all the teeth. So that worked out well. So now I'm going to do the same thing over here. Start at the far corner, right next to the line on the inside of the waist. Jumped out. I'm trying to use nice long strokes, so I use all the teeth so that the ones in the middle don't get dulled first. trying not to cross my baseline. And now there are lots of ways to remove this waste. A lot of people will do it just with a chisel, just chop it out. I prefer to take a coping saw and get most of it out. But a coping saw was my very first saw as a kid, so I'm pretty good at it. So I can get really close to that baseline. And I'm much closer on the other side, as you'll see. And so I have very little waste to chisel out. So now let's chisel it out. And the way you do this is, I don't want to, chisel into this really nice bench. And some shops actually charge their employees if they do such a thing. So I don't want to get charged. So I have my chisel, I have my work, and a lot of people take this way too far. They clamp this 10 ways from Sunday. Really, you are a highly effective clamp. And so I'm going to hold the chisel like a pencil, and then I'm going to put my arm on the work, so that's my clamp, and I'm going to chop down. And what's key about this is that I can see if the chisel is vertical or not by putting my head right here. A lot of people will chop like this, or they will chop like this from the end. And if you do that, you can't see if you're vertical, and so you'll never get a square baseline except by pure happenstance. So this is the proper way to get that waste out. So I try to remove half the waste left from the saw and go halfway down through the work. And then do the same thing. Try to remove half of the waste that is left and halfway through the work. And if I can't remove, if the chisel will not remove half the waste, then I drop into the baseline like I am here. And so now that side is done. So flip it over and do the same thing here. So got a little waste in the angles ends. So now I can stick my pin board back into my vise, and I want to check the floor, because one of the biggest mistakes that woodworkers make is the floor of their pin board is not level. There's a hump in it, and so that will prevent the tail from closing all the way. So I'm going to first just get in there with the same chisel and remove any obvious pieces of junk that I didn't chisel out, which I don't have too much. And now I'm going to put my head down here and I'm going to bob it up and down so that I'm looking at the front of my joint and the back of my joint. And if when I bob my head up and down, the back part of the joint disappears behind the front part of the joint all at the same time, then the floor is probably flat. I can see, because of that, just a very little hump right there, which I'm going to pare out. And your eye will become very well tuned to these little humps very quickly after cutting just a couple dovetails. Okay. So I think we're almost ready for a test fit. So I'm going to take my tail board, and there's one last operation you want to perform to the tail board that really aids assembly and also prevents mistakes. And that is on the inside of the joint, the part of the joint that is going to go into the pin, is you want to relieve those corners, these corners right here, and right here. And those corners will allow the inside of the joint to ease into the pin board. The second thing it will do is it will prevent you from trying to make a mistake by putting this into the other pin board before it's time. Because if you pick this up and say, oh, I'm going to test it in my other pin board, and you see, oh, those corners are relieved, then you've already completed that joint. So it's a little aid for for not making mistakes. Now, there are lots of ways to do this. You can get in there with a pocket knife and cut them out, or I will just get in there with a chisel. I don't like to chisel towards my hands, but I'm very good at that, and so that's a no-no if you haven't done that much in your life. But that is what it should look like in the end. And so the joint should go together with hand pressure. Okay, there we go. So this went together, but as I can see, you know, I've got there's a lot of this darkness is pencil line, but this side of the joint is open a little bit, and this side's pretty good. What that usually means is that I've got some junk on the wall here, and you can sort of see those tines, parts of the pin go back in, and so this is a little thick, and it's pushing out these a little bit. It's bending them out. So I'm just going to get in there with a chisel and kind of relieve part of this wall in an area that doesn't show, just so that I get a nice tight looking joint. And it will look a lot better once you get some glue on it and we get the pencil lines planed away. So there's also just a little bit right there. I didn't catch that. So I'm just going to get in there. And that goes in much nicer, much tighter. And once we get the glue on, and once we get everything clamped up and on there, it'll be nice and tight, and we get the pencil lines off. It won't look so gappy. It's not really all that gappy. Pencil lines are really make you look worse than you are. So now that I have this corner of the joint done, I'm going to put this aside, and I am going to put the tail on the front of the other board, and then cut the pin on the other end, and then we will assemble this around the lid, and the lid will be essentially complete with just a little bit of tweaking, and we are going to be ready to finish up the outside of the case and make a few sliding tills.